Unfortunately, the only real big headline is kind of a downer. Texas Tech linebacker Bryce Ramirez has a second surgery. I believe it was announced Monday, I believe.
Yeah.
He had a broken leg, and he will remain in the hospital a couple days after, and he suffered the injury. As you remember, the game kind of shut down, came to a halt. A lot of people were tweeting about it this past weekend against NC State. He is expected to return to the campus. He stayed in Raleigh, and he had surgery there, and he's expected to return to Lubbock. Of course, this now kind of puts him on the road to recovery. Obviously, his season's done. He has to be, rehab, all that stuff. Craven, what does this kind of do for the Tech defense? And, it was such a, it was supposed to be such a momentous occasion in that, that opportunity to be on the road at a ranked team. Just kind of a lot of gas just kind of went out the building. Anytime an injury like that happens where the game kind of shuts down, it's pretty gruesome to watch, obviously. And you kind of have to psych yourself back into the game. I don't want to blame that for the loss, but I know that Tech as a team just wasn't the same after that. And no team is after you see something like that happen to your teammate.
Yeah, it was a pretty horrific scene. They had to bring a towel out there to put over his leg.
Right.
They didn't show the replay of the injury on ESPN's broadcast, which, as we know, ESPN they'll show an injury.
I was about to say they'll go crazy. Yeah.
So it had to be pretty bad for them to pull that. I don't know how much of an impact this is for Texas Tech defense. Obviously, you're losing a guy who's rotational. He has 4 tackles on the season, so this isn't a starter. This isn't like your frontline guy.
Sure.
But when you're going to go play against a Texas team that put 70 points on you last year and who's had a lot of success running the football, their best 2 players offensively are Bijan Robinson, Rashawn Johnson. You need all your linebackers. You need all your front 7 guys. So a Texas Tech team that isn't over – they don't have a ton of depth anyway, so losing a guy like that isn't going to help at all. But for us, it's just I hope he's okay.
Sure, 100%.
You have 2 surgeries like that back to back. You have to stay in Raleigh. That means you can't handle the pressure, the air pressure of flying in your leg. And so it's just a scary thing. And so for him to be on the right track, for him to have a couple successful surgeries, and for him to be heading back to Lubbock, hopefully by the end of the week, is just good news for us.
Yeah, and it's one of those guys that, like you mentioned, he's not necessarily an all-conference player, but he was one of the guys that I think got awarded a scholarship over the offseason. So it was like you can tell that he was one of those guys that the teammates love being around, that the coaching staff grew to adore, things like that. So seeing that happen to him is definitely something that, again, it just kind of takes – you're in game mode. You're, like, really focused on beating the other team, and all of a sudden you're like, is Bryce okay? Right, is Bryce okay?
Right. It was one of those injuries that just took your breath away by seeing it, just because it was so gruesome.
Like Craven mentioned, like TV broadcasts aren't afraid of showing injuries, right? They'll show like an ACL or whatever, it doesn't matter. But like the fact that they were like, nope, we're done. Like it's like that's enough.
I think his bone came out of his leg.
Right, I was about to say, I think it was, And so it's like one of those visuals where you're just like, we're not like
we're not gonna show that.
That traumatizes people too. Like as a teammate, seeing that happen, you're just like, oh my god,
Right.
So definitely best wishes are with him and his road to recovery. One last bit of semi-headlines. I mean, I don't know. It's not really a headline. The game's happening. Skillet's on this weekend. TCU at SMU, by the way, sold out Ford. Which, by the way, I learned a couple years ago that Gerald Ford Stadium's not that Gerald Ford.
Right.
I did not know that until, I think 4 years ago. Because I was like, oh, look, Gerald Ford. And I was like, not that one. I was like, what? there's another one? Anyway, regardless, Craven has a story. Because if you haven't heard, Sonny Dykes used to coach at SMU. And
didn't know that.
He hired Rhett Lashley, who now coaches at SMU. So, naturally, they know each other. And obviously with rivals, Sonny Dykes going to their rival in TCU, Craven, it was a great time for you to write a feature on kind of their connection and how Rhett Lashley got to SMU. And just talk a little bit about it. It's up on TexasFootball.com. I love the lead-in where they met at a recruiting trip.
Yep.
And just happened to that was just the first time they stayed connected. And then all of a sudden, some years later, boom.
College football, it's like any other industry. It's who you know more than what you know. They shared agents, so that helped them early on in their career. But, yeah, they were just at a high school game in 2015 on the sideline recruiting the same quarterback. Rhett Lashley grew up in Northwest Arkansas, so Spike Dykes was a name he knew just from the Southwest Conference and following Arkansas football as they played Texas Tech. So apparently they just kind of talked on the sideline a little bit, no different than, probably happens dozens of times each football seasons where you run into opposing coaches. At that time, Rhett Lashley was the offensive coordinator at Auburn, and Sonny Dykes was the head coach at Cal. Sonny Dykes leaves Cal, gets fired from Cal as an analyst for a year at TCU, and then lands at SMU, and he calls up Rhett Lashley, who had gone and become the offensive coordinator at UConn. According to Rhett, The reason is because Sonny Dykes saw the passing game that he was using, and it was similar to what they were using in the air raid. But Sonny at Cal had figured out we're going to have to run the football to win football games. We can't do this 60 passing times a game type situation. So Sonny jokes that he got kicked out of the air raid after that decision, but it brought in Rhett Lashley because Rhett Lashley had the passing air raid type scheme, but he also had been with Gus Malzahn and really run the football a lot, and he wanted to kind of ingratiate that into SMU. The first year is not as great as they want it to be, but the second year they go, they win 10 games. It's their best year since the death penalty, and Rhett goes on to Miami. But the last couple weeks of the season last year, with Texas Tech and TCU open, everybody knew Sonny Dykes was going somewhere.
One of those jobs, yeah.
And what was interesting to me is that Sonny reached out to Rhett.
Interesting.
And was like, hey, if I leave here, would you want this job? And so Sonny basically got Rhett the head coaching job again at SMU, right?
Yeah.
He brought him in there originally and then reached back out. And if you talk to the SMU athletic director, Rick Hart, they considered Rhett Lashley the in-house hire, even though he was at Miami for a year.
Right.
And so that familiarity, I just find it to be interesting. It's interesting that a former head coach leaves for its rival. It's interesting that rival is 30 minutes away.
Yeah.
It's interesting that rival is in the same metroplex. And it's very interesting that now the head coach you're coaching against is one of your good friends.
Yeah.
And so just a lot of layers to this game, a lot of narratives to this game. But as Rhett said, as soon as kickoff happens, it's Dallas versus Fort Worth. It's SMU versus TCU. It's not about Rhett or Sonny. But it is a fun narrative leading into the game. And it's one of the main reasons why this game is sold out.
Yeah, 100%. We'll talk about this game when we get to our games. But one of the things that I do love about kind of both of their trajectories as coaches is neither of them were like – fast forward to when Sonny Dykes was hired, right? Neither of them were like the dynamite hire, right? Like Sonny Dykes was coming off of Cal. It was like, man, is he that great of a head coach right after Louisiana Tech? Can this offense kind of work? Rhett Lashley, look at his resume. It's not a stellar resume, right? Those Auburn teams, some people wonder how much was him versus running Gus Malzahn's offense, right? Obviously, you take some concepts with you. But you look at his resume, and it's like, okay, he was with them at Arkansas State, of course, Auburn, and UConn. Right? Now you're like, okay, well, that's a weird pit stop right there.
Yeah.
And
he wanted to just strike out on his own.
Right.
He had been with Gus every step of the way.
Exactly.
Until UConn.
And so, and then that UConn job happened. You're like, oh, that's a weird. And of course, UConn's kind of a hard job in general. And so when Sonny Dykes hires him at SMU, it's like, oh, that's an interesting name, but not necessarily a dynamite. Right. Obviously, he turned into what he turned into, got the Miami job, and now he's established his own identity as an offensive mind. So, but Sonny Dykes the same way. It was, SMU hires him. I was like, oh, I guess that's a pretty good hire, right? Cal flames out, whatever. But all of a sudden, now it's like, okay, now he's able to get that TCU job, and people kind of write that Cal tenure. Both parties kind of write that Cal tenure off as like, both didn't work out for either of us.
Right.
So it is a kind of a fascinating career trajectory for both of those guys.
And another interesting part of it is I've always wondered, like, what's it like being a play caller for a coach who was a play caller?
Sure.
Offensively or defensively. Like,
Right.
I'd imagine it's a pressured job to be the defensive coordinator at Alabama, for example.
Sure.
Sonny Dykes is an offensive guy. He was an offensive play caller for most of his career. And so I asked Rhett, was there any hesitancy to go be the offensive coordinator for a guy who was an offensive coordinator? And Rhett said, to Sonny's credit, didn't come into an offensive meeting once to tell him to do something different. Didn't take away play calling one time. It wasn't like there wasn't a game where the series, it was getting really close and Sonny started calling plays or anything like that. He really let Rhett go do it himself. I think that allowed Rhett to grow as a coach, and I think that's why their relationship is so tight.
Yeah. So, like I said, we will talk more about that game. Spoilers, it will be one of our 3 games to watch this weekend, so we will get into that preview here in a bit.